They say success runs in the family. But what happens when a father's love becomes so twisted by pride that he becomes his own son's worst enemy? In 1975, Dean Paul Martin was on the verge of becoming a major recording star. He had talent, charisma, and the golden voice of his legendary father. But just as his career was about to take off, something stopped him cold. Not a lack of talent, not bad luck, not even the music industry's notorious cruelty. It was his own father. Dean Martin, the king of cool, secretly destroyed his son's dreams because he believed love meant making the boy suffer. The year was 1975, and Dean Paul Martin was 24 years old. To the world, he seemed to have everything. Movie star looks inherited from his father, genuine musical talent that couldn't be faked, and the kind of natural charisma that made audiences fall in love instantly. He had formed a pop group called Dino, Desi, and Billy, with Desi Arnaz Jr. and Billy Hinsche, and they were enjoying moderate success on the charts. But Dean Paul wanted more than moderate success. He wanted to prove himself as a solo artist, to step out of his famous father's shadow and make his own mark on the world. That's when the problems began. Dean Paul had been working with Capitol Records on his debut solo album. The label was excited about his potential, seeing him as a younger version of his father with crossover appeal. They had invested significant money in his project, hiring top producers and arranging for major promotional campaigns. Everything was falling into place for Dean Paul to become a star in his own right. But then, mysteriously, things started going wrong. First, the studio time Dean Paul had booked was suddenly unavailable. The label claimed there was a scheduling conflict, but no one could explain exactly what had happened. Then, the producers who had been enthusiastic about working with him began backing out one by one, citing vague concerns about the project's direction. Radio stations that had initially shown interest in his demos stopped returning calls. Magazine interviews that had been arranged were quietly canceled. Dean Paul couldn't understand what was happening. His manager was baffled. His mother, Jean Martin, was suspicious. But Dean Paul himself refused to believe what everyone around him was starting to whisper, that his own father was sabotaging his career. The truth was even worse than they imagined. Dean Martin had been making phone calls, quiet, private phone calls to people who mattered in the music industry. Not threats exactly, but suggestions. Hints that maybe it would be better if young Dean Paul learned to struggle a little, learned what it meant to earn success the hard way instead of having it handed to him because of his famous name. The boy needs to find his own way, Dean would tell record executives over drinks. He's got talent, but talent isn't enough. He needs to learn what rejection feels like. To outsiders, it sounded like a concerned father. But to those who knew Dean Martin well, there was something darker in his tone. This wasn't about protection. This was about control. Dean Martin had built his entire career on the principle that nobody gave you anything for free. He had clawed his way up from the clubs of Steubenville, Ohio, had endured years of rejection and humiliation before finally making it big. He had a deep, almost pathological resentment of anyone who seemed to have things too easy, and that included his own son. "I don't want people saying he got where he is because of me," Dean told his longtime friend and manager, Mort Viner. "I want him to earn it. I want him to suffer for it the way I did." But what Dean didn't seem to understand, or didn't want to acknowledge, was that his son was already suffering. Dean Paul lived every day with the weight of his father's legacy, constantly compared to a man whose shoes seemed impossible to fill. He had chosen music, not because it was easy, but because it was the only way he knew how to express himself. And now, just as he was finding his voice, his own father was systematically silencing him. The breaking point came in late 1975. Dean Paul had finally secured a meeting with a major label executive who seemed genuinely interested in his work. He had prepared for weeks, rehearsing his songs and polishing his presentation. This was his chance to prove himself, to show that he was more than just Dean Martin's son. His mother, Jeanne, had helped him pick out his outfit, and his friends had wished him luck. Everyone in his circle was rooting for him, believing that this might finally be the breakthrough he desperately needed. The meeting seemed to go well. The executive was impressed with Dean Paul's voice and his songwriting ability. He talked about recording contracts and promotional opportunities, even mentioned possible tour dates and television appearances. Dean Paul left feeling more hopeful than he had in months, calling his girlfriend to share the good news and planning how he would celebrate if the deal went through. 3 days later, the executive called to say the deal was off. No explanation, no room for negotiation, just a cold, final rejection that left Dean Paul devastated and confused. The executive's tone had completely changed from enthusiastic to dismissive, as if something fundamental had shifted in those 3 short days. What Dean Paul didn't know was that his father had called the executive the night after the meeting. "I heard you met with my boy," Dean had said, his voice friendly but carrying an undertone that made the executive nervous. "Yes, he's very talented. We're considering—" "That's nice," Dean interrupted. "But I think it might be better if you didn't sign him. Not yet. The kid needs to learn some lessons first. Hard lessons. The kind that make you strong." The executive, who had been hoping to maintain a good relationship with Dean Martin, understood the message. This wasn't a request. It was an order disguised as fatherly concern. Dean Paul never found out about that phone call. He never learned about the dozens of other calls his father made, the quiet conversations that killed opportunities before they could fully develop. All Dean Paul knew was that doors kept slamming in his face, that the music industry seemed determined to reject him no matter how hard he tried or how talented he was. The psychological damage was devastating. Dean Paul began to doubt his own abilities, to wonder if he was deluding himself about his talent. He started drinking more, struggling with the depression that comes from repeated professional rejection. His relationship with his father became strained as he sensed, without understanding why, that Dean Martin was somehow connected to his failures. Friends noticed that the once confident young man was becoming withdrawn, questioning everything about himself, wondering if he was living in a fantasy world where he believed he had talent that others couldn't see. The worst part was the isolation. Dean Paul couldn't talk to his father about his struggles because Dean seemed oddly unsympathetic to his son's career problems. He couldn't confide in industry friends because he didn't want to seem like he was making excuses. He was trapped in a prison of self-doubt, not knowing that the walls had been built by the one person who should have been tearing them down. "Dad, I don't understand what's happening," Dean Paul said during one of their increasingly rare conversations. "Everyone says I have talent, but nobody wants to work with me." Dean Martin looked at his son with what appeared to be sympathy, but was actually something much colder. "That's the business, kid. Maybe you're just not ready yet. But I have been working hard. I've been trying everything." Dean took a sip of his martini and shrugged. "Sometimes things just don't work out. Maybe it's time to consider other careers." Dean Paul stared at his father in shock. "You want me to give up music? I want you to be realistic. Not everyone gets to be a star." It was a brutal moment of betrayal disguised as practical advice. Dean Martin was essentially telling his son to abandon his dreams while secretly being the reason those dreams were being crushed. The final blow came in 1976. Dean Paul had been offered a small recording contract with an independent label. It wasn't the major deal he had hoped for, but it was a chance to make music and build an audience. He was excited about the opportunity, finally feeling like his persistence was paying off. But when he told his father about the contract, Dean Martin's reaction was immediate and harsh. An independent label? That's not a real record deal. That's amateur hour. If you sign with them, you'll be marking yourself as a failure. No major label will ever take you seriously after that. Dean Paul was confused. But it's a start, Dad. I have to start somewhere. No, Dean said firmly. If you're going to do this, you do it right or you don't do it at all. Wait for a real opportunity. Wait for a major label. Under pressure from his father, and believing that Dean Martin's experience in the entertainment industry made his advice valuable, Dean Paul turned down the contract. He waited for a major label opportunity that, thanks to his father's sabotage, would never come. By 1977, Dean Paul had essentially given up on his music career. The constant rejection had broken his spirit, and his father's lack of support had convinced him that maybe he really didn't have what it took. He turned his attention to other pursuits, eventually becoming a pilot in the Air National Guard, seeking the validation in military service that he had never found in music. The irony was devastating. Dean Paul had all the talent in the world, but his own father had convinced the industry that he wasn't worth the risk. He died in 1987 believing he was a musical failure, never knowing that his father had orchestrated that failure from the very beginning. It wasn't until years later, after Dean Paul's tragic death in a plane crash in 1987, that the truth began to emerge. Friends in the music industry, feeling guilty about their silence, began to talk about the phone calls they had received from Dean Martin. The pattern became clear. Dean Martin had systematically destroyed his own son's career because he believed that struggle built character, that easy success would ruin the boy. One record executive, speaking anonymously, said, "We all knew what Dean was doing, but nobody had the courage to stand up to him. He was too powerful, too connected." What Dean never seemed to understand was that his son's struggles weren't building character. They were destroying it. Dean Paul died believing he was a failure, never knowing that his father had been the architect of that failure. Jean Martin, Dean's ex-wife and Dean Paul's mother, was devastated when she learned the truth. "Dean thought he was making Dino stronger," she said years later, "but all he did was break him. He killed his son's dreams because he was afraid they came too easily." The tragedy of Dean Martin's sabotage wasn't just that he hurt his son's career. It was that he did it out of love, or what he believed was love. Dean had confused cruelty with character building, had mistaken emotional abuse for tough parenting. He had taken his own painful experiences climbing to the top of the entertainment industry and decided that his son needed to suffer the same way. But what Dean failed to recognize was that every generation faces different challenges, that his son's path didn't need to mirror his own. Dean Paul didn't need to suffer the way his father had suffered. He needed support, encouragement, and the kind of unconditional love that celebrates success rather than sabotaging it. In the end, Dean Martin's twisted form of parental love cost him everything. His son never achieved his musical dreams, never got the chance to prove himself as an artist, never experienced the joy of success in the field he was passionate about. And Dean himself was left with the knowledge, discovered too late, that he had been his own son's worst enemy when he should have been his greatest champion. The King of Cool had spent his entire career hiding his emotions, maintaining a facade of casual indifference that made him seem untouchable. But when it came to his son, that emotional distance became a weapon that destroyed the very thing he claimed to love most. Dean Martin had proven that sometimes the cruelest enemies are the ones who claim to act out of love.